November 18, 1969. The Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly beneath a moonless sky as the freighter Smuggling Alpha cut through dark waters 40 nautical miles off the coast of Cyprus. Captain Lars Henriksen stood on the bridge, confident that his cargo manifest listing agricultural machinery would raise no suspicions at any port from Alexandria to Beirut. He believed his ship was just another commercial vessel navigating the ancient trade routes of the Mediterranean, carrying ordinary goods to ordinary destinations. He had no idea that Israeli intelligence had been tracking his vessel for 3 weeks, that analysts in Tel Aviv had already photographed every crate loaded in Antwerp, or that beneath those tarps labeled as irrigation equipment sat Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles destined for Palestinian militant groups operating from Jordan. What Captain Henriksen didn't know was about to cost him everything and reveal one of the most audacious maritime intelligence operations of the Cold War era. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. 3 months earlier, on a sweltering August afternoon in Tel Aviv, David Kimche sat in a windowless conference room deep within Mossad headquarters, studying surveillance photographs spread across a mahogany table. The images showed a Danish-flagged cargo ship docked in Hamburg, ordinary enough except for one detail that made Kimche's pulse quicken. A telephoto shot captured 2 men supervising the loading, men whose faces matched known operatives of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Kimche was 41 years old, a veteran of Israeli intelligence since the founding of the state, fluent in 7 languages, and possessed of a mind that connected disparate pieces of information like a master chess player seeing moves ahead. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and turned to his colleague Avraham Shalom, who had just entered carrying a folder thick with documents. Shalom, a compact man with intense dark eyes and the cautious movements of someone trained to notice everything, set the folder down with deliberate care. The 2 men had worked together for nearly a decade, developing the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared danger and shared purpose. "Where did these come from?" Kimche asked, tapping the photographs. "Our station in Bonn," Shalom replied. "They've been watching this ship for 2 weeks, the Smuggling Alpha, registered in Liberia, actually owned by a shell company in Panama, operated by a Danish captain who asks very few questions about his cargo." Kimche selected another photograph, this one showing wooden crates being loaded by crane. The markings on the crates were in Cyrillic. "Those aren't agricultural supplies," Kimche observed. "No," Shalom confirmed. "Our source in Antwerp says the cargo originated in Gdansk, Polish port, Soviet oversight. The manifest lists irrigation pumps and tractor parts, but the weight distribution is all wrong. Those crates are too heavy for agricultural equipment." "How certain are we?" Kimche asked. Shalom opened his folder and extracted a customs document. "Our analyst in Warsaw intercepted this. It's a Soviet export license for 12 SA-7 surface-to-air missiles, portable launcher systems, the kind that could turn any militant with basic training into a serious threat to our aircraft." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Kimche understood immediately what this meant. Israel had fought 3 wars since its founding 21 years ago, and the threat from Palestinian militant groups had escalated dramatically since the 6-Day War 2 years earlier. Portable anti-aircraft missiles in the hands of militants could change the tactical balance, make every flight a risk, every helicopter insertion a potential massacre. "What's the route?" Kimche asked. Shalom traced a finger across a maritime chart. "Hamburg to Antwerp for additional cargo, then south through the English Channel into the Mediterranean. Current intelligence suggests they'll offload somewhere along the Lebanese coast, probably north of Beirut, where Palestinian camps have heavy presence. From there, the weapons get distributed throughout the region." Kimche stood and walked to the window. Though the thick curtains remained closed as they always did in this secure facility, he was calculating probabilities, weighing options, considering consequences. "We can't let those missiles reach shore," he said finally. "But we can't just sink a civilian vessel in international waters. That's an act of war, or at least enough of one to cause diplomatic catastrophe." Shalom nodded, "Which is why I've already started planning something else. We take the ship, Board it, seize the cargo, redirect it to Haifa. Make it look like a legitimate interdiction based on intelligence about weapons smuggling. In international waters, Kimche said skeptically. With a Danish captain and a Liberian flag and a route that doesn't come within 200 miles of Israeli territory, we make it come within range, Shalom said. We create a situation where boarding becomes necessary, a distress call perhaps, or we wait until they're in waters where we have legal pretext. Kimche returned to the table, studying the maritime charts with renewed focus. The Siersberg Alpha's projected route would take it through the Strait of Sicily, then eastward along the southern coast of the Mediterranean. There would be a window, perhaps 12 hours, when the ship would pass within reach of Israeli naval assets operating from Haifa. This needs to go to the Prime Minister, Kimche said. Golda won't approve anything this risky without seeing all the intelligence. Shalom smiled thinly. I briefed her yesterday. She wants it done. Her exact words were that we cannot allow Soviet weapons to turn our pilots into sitting targets. She's authorized a naval special operations team and given us operational discretion. Over the following weeks, a plan took shape that combined traditional naval interdiction with the kind of creative deception that had become Mossad's signature. The operation would involve Navy commandos from Shayatet 13, Israel's elite naval special forces unit, but the initial approach would come from an unexpected direction. The planning sessions consumed entire days, with intelligence analysts, naval officers, legal advisors, and diplomatic experts all contributing their expertise. Each aspect of the operation had to be considered, from the initial surveillance that would track the Siersberg Alpha across the Mediterranean to the final disposition of the seized cargo and crew. Nothing could be left to chance, because a single mistake could turn a successful interdiction into an international incident. Kimche and Shalom worked closely with Admiral Shlomo Erel, the Navy's chief of operations, a man whose career had spanned from the founding of the Israeli Navy to its current status as a sophisticated modern force. Erel brought practical naval experience to balance the intelligence community's sometimes overly ambitious plans. He understood what was possible at sea and what was merely theoretical. During one particularly intense planning session, Errol spread maritime charts across the conference table, pointing to the projected route of the Siersberg Alpha with a steady finger. The legal complications of this operation concern me greatly, he said. We're talking about boarding a foreign-flagged vessel in international waters without clear legal authority. Even with the best intelligence, we're operating in a gray area that could have serious consequences. Kimche nodded, understanding the Admiral's concerns. That's why we need to create circumstances that give us legal cover, however thin. If we respond to a distress call and happen to encounter this ship, if we conduct what appears to be a routine security inspection, if we discover the weapons through legitimate search procedures, the legal ground becomes more defensible. And if the international community doesn't accept that justification, Shalom added, we'll have 12 surface-to-air missile systems that aren't shooting down our aircraft. Sometimes the strategic imperative outweighs diplomatic niceties. Errol studied both men, then looked back at his charts. I'm not arguing against the operation. I'm ensuring we understand the risks. My crews will execute whatever orders they receive, but they deserve to know exactly what they're being asked to do and why. The planning also involved detailed intelligence work to ensure they understood every aspect of the Siersberg Alpha and her crew. Mossad analysts compiled dossiers on Captain Henriksen, researching his career, his financial situation, his character. They needed to predict how he would react to being intercepted, whether he would resist or cooperate, whether he knew about his real cargo or was genuinely ignorant. The profile that emerged suggested Henriksen was a competent but unremarkable merchant captain who had fallen on difficult financial times. His shipping company had struggled with competition from larger firms, and he had taken increasingly marginal jobs to keep his vessel operating. The payment for this particular voyage was substantially higher than normal rates, suggesting he had been specifically recruited rather than randomly hired. Intelligence also identified each crew member, checking for potential connections to militant groups or intelligence services. The crew appeared to be legitimate merchant sailors, most with decades of experience, none with obvious ties to the Palestinian groups or Soviet intelligence. This supported the theory that Henriksen and his crew were unwitting participants, hired and deceived rather than willing conspirators. Understanding the crew composition influenced the operational planning. If the boarding team expected resistance from trained militants, the approach would be entirely different from dealing with civilian sailors. Almog and his commandos planned for both scenarios, but hoped for the latter. The goal was interdiction, not combat. Lieutenant Commander Yosef Dagan stood on the deck of the Israeli missile boat Herev, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean on November 17. At 34, Dagan was young for his rank, but his service record spoke for itself. He had commanded successful operations during the Six-Day War and had earned a reputation for both tactical brilliance and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. His orders were unusual, delivered personally by a Mossad officer who provided details about a civilian freighter, and instructions that seemed to blur every line between naval operations and intelligence work. Now, with those orders sealed in the safe in his cabin, Dagan prepared his crew for an operation unlike any they had trained for. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Avi Rosen, joined him at the rail. Rosen was a decade older, a career naval officer who had survived the sinking of the destroyer Eilat 2 years earlier, and carried the quiet intensity of someone who had looked death in the face. "The team is ready," Rosen reported. "They've been briefed on the target and the timetable. They understand this needs to look legitimate." Dagan nodded. "Any word on the freighter's current position?" "Last satellite pass puts her approximately 300 nautical miles west-northwest of our position, making 12 knots on a heading that will bring her into our intercept zone by 0400 tomorrow morning. Weather forecast is favorable, calm seas, minimal wind." "And our cover story?" Dagan asked. Rosen pulled a document from his jacket. "We received a distress call from a civilian yacht reporting engine failure. We're responding to render assistance. When we encounter the Siersberg Alpha in the same area, we'll conduct a routine inspection based on intelligence regarding weapons smuggling in the region." "Routine inspections in international waters," Dagan said dryly. "The lawyers in Tel Aviv assure us there's precedent," Rosen replied with equal irony. "Something about the inherent right of nations to protect themselves from imminent threats." Both men understood the reality. This operation existed in the gray zone where international law met national security, where the rules written in peacetime confronted the necessities of a nation that had known only war. If they failed, if the operation went wrong and became public, it could spark an international incident. If they succeeded but were discovered, the diplomatic costs could be severe. And if those missiles reached their destination, Israeli pilots would pay the price in blood. The Herev left port at 2200 hours, running dark across the Mediterranean. On board were 12 commandos from Shayatet 13, men who could swim 5 miles in full combat gear, breach a ship's hull underwater, or rappel from a helicopter onto a moving deck. They spent the transit checking equipment, reviewing ship layouts, and preparing for every contingency from peaceful surrender to armed resistance. Sergeant David Almog led the boarding team. At 28, he was a veteran of dozens of operations, including the raid on Beirut International Airport the previous year. He sat in the ready room, methodically checking his weapon while around him his team did the same. "Remember," Almog told his men, "this is an interdiction, not an assault. We board fast, we secure the crew with minimum force, we verify the cargo. If they resist, we respond proportionally. But our goal is to take this ship intact with everyone alive to tell their story." One of the younger commandos, a kid barely 20 named Moshe, who everyone called Moshi, raised a hand. "What if the crew fights back? What if they're armed?" Almog met his eyes steadily. "Then we do what we're trained to do. We neutralize the threat and secure the vessel. But intelligence suggests this is a merchant crew, civilians who are either ignorant of their real cargo or were paid to look the other way. They're not soldiers. We treat them accordingly." At 0330 hours, radar operators on the Herev detected a contact matching the Siersberg Alpha's profile. The freighter was exactly where intelligence predicted, maintaining course and speed, showing navigation lights as required by maritime law. She was a mid-sized cargo vessel, approximately 120 meters in length, riding low in the water under the weight of her cargo. Commander Dagan studied the radar screen, calculating distances and approach vectors. The Herev was faster and more maneuverable than the lumbering freighter, but timing would be critical. They needed to intercept in a location that gave them legal cover, however thin, and in circumstances that would make resistance pointless. Communications, Dagan ordered, broadcast on international maritime frequency. Inform them we're responding to a distress call in this area and request they heave to for a routine security check. The radio operator complied, sending the message in English, the common language of the sea. For several minutes there was no response. The Smuggling Alpha maintained course and speed, her navigation light steady against the dark horizon. Try again, Dagan instructed. Add that we have intelligence regarding illegal weapons shipments through this corridor, and that all vessels are subject to inspection under international maritime security protocols. This time the response came quickly, the Danish captain's voice crackling over the speaker with barely concealed irritation. This is Captain Henriksen of the Smuggling Alpha. We are in international waters on a lawful commercial voyage. We do not recognize your authority to conduct inspections. Dagan picked up the microphone himself. Captain Henriksen, this is Commander Dagan of the Israeli Navy. I appreciate your position, but I have orders to inspect vessels matching certain criteria in this area. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can interpret your refusal as suspicious behavior warranting further action. I strongly recommend cooperation. There was a longer pause this time. Dagan could imagine the scene on the freighter's bridge, the captain consulting his charts, perhaps trying to raise his employer by radio, calculating whether resistance was worth the risk. Finally, Henriksen's voice returned. Very well, Commander. We are heaving to, but I am filing a formal protest with the Danish Maritime Authority and the International Maritime Organization. Your protest is noted and respected, Captain, Dagan replied. Please prepare your crew for boarding and have your cargo manifest ready for inspection. The Herev closed the distance rapidly, her powerful engines bringing her alongside the now stationary freighter within 15 minutes. Searchlights illuminated the Smuggling Alpha's deck, revealing a typical cargo configuration with containers and tarped equipment secured to the deck and cargo holds below. The boarding team assembled at the rail, equipment checked and rechecked. They would go over on rigid inflatable boats, fast ropes allowing them to deploy onto the freighter's deck in under 2 minutes. Speed was essential, not because they expected resistance, but because every second of the operation needed to convey professional inevitability. Go, Dagan ordered. The commandos moved with practiced efficiency, sliding down ropes into the inflatable boats that launched from the Herev's side. Engines roared to life, and the small boats crossed the gap between vessels, commandos standing ready with grappling hooks and boarding ladders. Almog was first over the rail, weapon raised but pointed safely down, eyes scanning for threats. The deck was clear except for 2 crewmen who stood with hands raised, their expressions mixing fear and confusion. Within 90 seconds, the entire boarding team was aboard, securing access points and herding the crew to a central location on deck. Captain Henriksen emerged from the bridge, a thick-set man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades at sea. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who commanded his vessel absolutely, even under these extraordinary circumstances. I am Captain Lars Henriksen, he announced in heavily accented English. This is an illegal action. You have no authority here. Almog lowered his weapon respectfully. Captain, I'm Sergeant Almog, Israeli Defense Forces. We're conducting a security inspection based on intelligence regarding weapons smuggling. Please assemble your crew and prepare to provide access to your cargo holds. My cargo is agricultural equipment, Henriksen protested. Irrigation pumps, tractor parts. All documented in my manifest. This is harassment, nothing more. Then you have nothing to worry about, Almog replied calmly. We'll verify your cargo and be on our way. Please cooperate fully. What Henriksen didn't know, couldn't know, was that Israeli intelligence had been inside his cargo long before it ever reached his ship. Mossad operatives had photographed the missiles during their transfer in Gdansk, tracked them through Antwerp, and documented every step of the loading process. The commandos boarding his ship knew exactly what they would find and where to find it. The inspection began in the forward hold. Almog descended the ladder with 4 commandos, their flashlights cutting through the darkness to reveal rows of wooden crates secured with heavy straps. The crates matched the descriptions in the intelligence briefing, Cyrillic markings stenciled on the sides, dimensions consistent with missile transport containers. "Get the manifest," Almog ordered. "Let's see what these are supposed to be." One of his men produced Captain Henriksen's cargo documents. According to the paperwork, the forward hold contained industrial irrigation pumps, each weighing approximately 200 kilograms, destined for agricultural development projects in Lebanon. Almog pulled a crowbar from his equipment belt and approached the nearest crate. The wood splintered easily, revealing layers of protective foam, and beneath that, the unmistakable cylindrical shape of a missile launch tube. The SA-7, NATO designation Strela II, Soviet-made portable surface-to-air missile system, exactly as intelligence had predicted. "We've got positive confirmation," Almog radioed to the Herev. "Cargo matches intelligence. Proceeding with full search." Over the next 2 hours, the commandos catalogued the entire shipment. 12 complete SA-7 systems with 48 missiles, 20 crates of ammunition for various small arms, 50 AK-47 assault rifles still in their original Soviet packaging, and 20 RPG-7 anti-tank weapons. Enough firepower to equip a small army, all hidden beneath manifests describing farm equipment. On the bridge of the Herev, Commander Dagan received the reports with grim satisfaction. The intelligence had been accurate, the operation had proceeded smoothly, and they now had undeniable proof of weapons smuggling. But the diplomatic complexity of what came next weighed heavily on his mind. Captain Henriksen was brought aboard the Herev, no longer defiant but clearly shaken by the discovery in his holds. He sat in Dagan's cabin, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, while the commander explained the situation. "Captain," Dagan began, "you've been transporting weapons of war disguised as agricultural equipment. Under international law, this constitutes smuggling and potentially arms trafficking in support of terrorist organizations." Henriksen's face had gone pale. "I didn't know," he said, and something in his voice suggested truth. "I was hired to transport cargo, paid well to ask no questions. The manifest said agricultural equipment. I saw no reason to doubt it." "Who hired you?" Dagan asked. "A shipping broker in Hamburg," Henriksen replied. "A man named Schmidt, though I doubt that was his real name. He paid half in advance, promised the rest on delivery. Said the cargo was time-sensitive, offered triple the normal rate. I should have known it was too good to be legitimate." Dagan felt a measure of sympathy for the man. Henriksen was no terrorist, just a merchant captain who had made a catastrophically bad decision. But sympathy couldn't change the facts or the necessity of what came next. "Your ship and cargo are being seized," Dagan informed him. "You and your crew will be taken to Israel, where you'll be questioned and eventually released. The weapons will be confiscated. You're fortunate that we intercepted you before you reached your destination, Captain. The people who hired you wouldn't have paid you. They would have killed you to silence any witnesses." The reality of how close he had come to death seemed to settle over Henriksen like a physical weight. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the coffee cup. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now we sail to Haifa," Dagan replied. "Your crew cooperates, answers questions truthfully, and eventually goes home. You face charges, probably in Denmark, for your role in this. But you'll be alive to face them." The Siersberg Alpha, now under Israeli control with a prize crew aboard, turned eastward toward Haifa accompanied by the Herev. The operation had taken less than 4 hours from first contact to securing the vessel, a textbook example of maritime interdiction. But the real work was just beginning. In Tel Aviv, David Kimche received the news with quiet satisfaction. The operation had achieved its primary objective, preventing advanced Soviet weapons from reaching militant groups. But it had also provided something equally valuable, concrete proof of Soviet arms smuggling through European ports, evidence that could be used diplomatically and strategically. Kimche sat in his office, drafting the initial report that would go to Prime Minister Meyer and eventually be shared in carefully edited form with Allied intelligence services. The story would emphasize the weapons seizure, the international smuggling network, and Israel's right to defend itself against such threats. It would minimize the legal ambiguities of the boarding, the questions about jurisdiction, the reality that this had been less an interdiction than a carefully planned hijacking. His phone rang. It was Shalom. "The ship is 3 hours from Haifa," Shalom reported. "The crew is cooperative, the cargo is secured, and our naval intelligence officers are already processing documents found aboard. You were right about this being bigger than one shipment." "What did they find?" Kimche asked. "Shipping schedules for 3 more vessels," Shalom said. "Encrypted communications equipment, names and contact information for handlers in 5 different countries. This wasn't a one-time transaction, David. This was an established pipeline, and we just got our hands on their entire operational network." Kimche allowed himself a rare smile. "Then we didn't just stop one shipment. We disrupted their entire supply chain." The Smuggling Alpha docked in Haifa as the sun rose on November 19, 1969. Israeli port authorities moved quickly, offloading the weapons under heavy security, while military intelligence officers conducted detailed searches of every compartment, every document, every scrap of paper that might yield information. Captain Henriksen and his crew were taken to a military facility for questioning. The interrogations were professional, not hostile. The Israelis understood that these were merchant sailors, not combatants, and treated them accordingly. Within a week, after providing full statements and cooperation, the crew members were released and repatriated to their home countries. Henriksen himself faced more extensive questioning. Over days of interviews, he provided details about the shipping broker in Hamburg, the payment arrangements, the loading procedures in Antwerp. He described how he had been assured the cargo was entirely legal, how the paperwork had seemed authentic, how the money had overcome his initial suspicions. Israeli intelligence cross-referenced every detail Henriksen provided with their existing files. The shipping broker in Hamburg was identified as a known associate of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The payment had been traced through a series of shell companies, ultimately funded by Soviet intelligence services. The Antwerp loading facility was connected to a network of sympathetic dock workers who facilitated illegal shipments. Each piece of information became part of a larger intelligence picture, revealing the infrastructure that supported Palestinian militant groups and the extent of Soviet involvement in arming them. The captured documents from the Smuggling Alpha included code names, safe houses, communication protocols, information that would allow Israeli and Allied intelligence services to disrupt similar operations for years to come. The intelligence exploitation went far beyond simply cataloging the physical weapons. Every document found aboard the ship was photographed, translated, and analyzed. Shipping invoices revealed patterns of previous deliveries. Communications logs showed contact with handlers in Damascus, Beirut, and Amman. Financial records exposed the money trail from Soviet sources through European banks to the smuggling network. One particularly valuable discovery was a small notebook kept by one of the ship's officers, apparently unaware of its significance. The notebook contained dates and port names, matching them against suspicious cargo loadings going back 18 months. Cross-referencing these entries with other intelligence allowed analysts to identify at least 6 previous weapons shipments that had successfully reached their destinations. This historical intelligence, while frustrating in revealing past failures, provided crucial data for understanding the network's operations. Analysts could now see patterns in timing, routing, and methodology. They could identify which ports were most commonly used, which shipping companies were involved, which officials might be corrupt or complicit. Each data point became part of a comprehensive picture that would guide future interdiction efforts. But perhaps the most significant impact of the operation was psychological. The seizure of the Smuggling Alpha sent an unmistakable message to those who would smuggle weapons to Israel's enemies. Nowhere was safe, no route was secure, no cover story was foolproof. Mossad could be watching from the docks of Dansk to the waters of the Mediterranean, and what seemed like a routine commercial voyage could end with commandos on your deck and your cargo in Israeli hands. 6 weeks after the seizure, David Kimche stood in a secure briefing room in Washington, presenting the details of the operation to senior officials from the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. The Americans were particularly interested in the Soviet connection, the evidence of weapons flowing from Warsaw Pact countries to Middle Eastern militant groups. This represents a pattern, Kimchi explained, using photographs of the seized weapons to illustrate his points. The Soviets aren't directly arming these groups, but they're creating the infrastructure and providing the weapons. Polish ports handle the shipping. East German companies provide false documentation. Czech intelligence services coordinate the logistics. It's a sophisticated operation designed to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring a steady flow of weapons. An American intelligence officer studied the photographs. "How confident are you in the intelligence about additional shipments?" "Very confident," Kimchi replied. "We've identified 3 other vessels using the same shipping broker and the same suspicious cargo patterns. We're coordinating with European port authorities to monitor these ships. Some will interdict, others will track to identify the complete network." The operation became a model for future Israeli maritime interdictions. Over the following years, similar operations were conducted against ships carrying weapons from various sources to various militant groups. Some seizures were public, used to demonstrate Israeli vigilance and gather international support. Others remained classified quiet victories in the ongoing intelligence war. For the commandos of Shayatet 13, who had boarded the Siersberg Alpha, the operation became a legend, told to new recruits. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence, the value of careful planning, and the effectiveness of decisive action. Sergeant Almog would go on to command the unit, leading operations throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. But he would always remember the November night when they had stopped a shipload of missiles from reaching Israeli shores. Captain Henriksen returned to Denmark, his career in tatters but his life intact. He faced smuggling charges, received a suspended sentence after cooperating fully with authorities, and never commanded a ship again. In interviews years later, he would speak carefully about his experience, acknowledging his mistake in accepting suspicious cargo and expressing grudging respect for the professionalism of the Israeli forces who had intercepted him. The missiles themselves, the 12 SA-7 systems that had started this entire operation, were analyzed by Israeli military intelligence and shared with American experts. The technical insights gained from examining these weapons contributed to developing countermeasures and understanding Soviet capabilities. Some were destroyed, others kept for training and analysis. All had been denied to the enemies who would have used them against Israeli aircraft. In the broader context of the Cold War, the seizure of the Siersberg Alpha represented a small but significant victory. It demonstrated that the conflict between East and West was fought not just in grand political maneuvers, but in the shadows of maritime shipping lanes, in the holds of cargo vessels, in the decisions of intelligence officers working to protect their nations. The operation also highlighted the complex web of actors in the Middle East conflict. Soviet weapons, European infrastructure, Palestinian militants, and Israeli intelligence all intersecting in ways that defied simple narratives of the Cold War. The Siersberg Alpha had been registered in Liberia, flagged in Denmark, loaded in Belgium, crewed by Scandinavians, carrying Soviet weapons funded by Middle Eastern groups and intercepted by Israeli forces. It was a microcosm of the interconnected world that the Cold War had created. The international diplomatic response to the seizure was carefully managed by Israeli officials. They presented evidence of the weapons to friendly governments, demonstrating the legitimacy of the interdiction. Photographs of the missiles, copies of the falsified cargo manifests, and intelligence about the intended recipients were shared selectively to build support for Israel's actions while minimizing criticism about the legal gray areas. European governments reacted with varying degrees of concern and support. The Danish government lodged formal protests about the detention of Captain Henriksen and his crew, but privately acknowledged that weapons smuggling was a serious violation that warranted action. Belgian authorities investigated the Antwerp loading facility, eventually charging several dock workers with facilitating illegal arms trafficking. The West German government, always sensitive about Cold War tensions, quietly thanked Israel for the intelligence about the Hamburg shipping broker while publicly maintaining neutrality. The Soviet Union, unable to publicly acknowledge its role in the weapons shipment, issued generic statements about Israeli aggression and maritime piracy. Soviet diplomats raised the issue in the United Nations, demanding condemnation of Israel's actions, but the evidence of weapons smuggling undermined their arguments. The international community largely viewed the interdiction as a legitimate security measure, however questionable the legal technicalities might have been. For Mossad, the operation validated their approach to intelligence work: meticulous research, patient surveillance, creative problem-solving, and decisive action when opportunity presented itself. David Kimche would rise to become one of the most influential figures in Israeli intelligence, playing key roles in operations around the world. But the Smuggling Alpha operation remained one of his proudest achievements because it was so clean, so effective, so perfectly executed. The story of the operation gradually became public through bits and pieces released over decades. Journalists pieced together accounts from declassified documents, interviews with participants, and forensic analysis of shipping records. What emerged was a portrait of intelligence work at its finest, identifying a threat, developing a plan, executing with precision, and achieving strategic objectives with minimal collateral damage. In military academies and intelligence training centers, the operation became a case study. Students analyzed the decision-making, the legal considerations, the tactical execution, and the strategic outcomes. What made it exemplary was not just the successful interdiction, but the integration of intelligence collection, operational planning, and diplomatic management. The farmers in Lebanon, who had been listed as the intended recipients of the supposed agricultural equipment, never received anything, of course. They probably never existed. The addresses on the shipping documents led to empty lots or abandoned buildings. The entire commercial cover story had been fabricated, a shell game designed to move weapons while maintaining plausible legitimacy. The Palestinian groups who had arranged for the weapons shipment never acknowledged the loss publicly. In the shadowy world of clandestine arms trafficking, admitting to a major seizure would have meant revealing capabilities, connections, and plans. Instead, the weapons simply failed to arrive, another setback in the ongoing struggle, another indication that the Israelis were always watching. For the Soviet intelligence services who had facilitated the shipment, the seizure was embarrassing, but not catastrophic. They would adjust their methods, find new routes, use different covers. The arms trafficking would continue because the political calculus that drove it remained unchanged. The Soviets wanted to support groups that opposed Israeli and American interests in the Middle East, and smuggling weapons was cheaper and less risky than direct military involvement. But for a window of time, measured in months or perhaps years, the weapons pipeline had been disrupted. Militant groups had to rely on older weapons, smaller stockpiles, less capable systems. Israeli pilots flew missions with slightly reduced risk. The balance of tactical capability shifted incrementally in Israel's favor. In the accounting of intelligence work, such incremental advantages often meant the difference between success and failure, between life and death. Lieutenant Commander Dagan, who had commanded the naval side of the operation, continued his career in the Israeli Navy, eventually reaching the rank of admiral. He would participate in operations during the Yom Kippur War 4 years later, where the tactical advantage gained from interdicting weapons shipments like the Smuggling Alpha would prove significant. Years after retirement, speaking to military historians, he would describe the operation as one of the most satisfying of his career precisely because it had prevented violence, rather than engaging in it. The crew of the Smuggling Alpha scattered after their release. Some continued in maritime careers, though none would speak publicly about their experience. Others left the sea entirely, the trauma of being boarded by commandos and facing potential charges having ended their love of sailing. They had been pawns in a larger game, civilians caught between intelligence services and militant groups, their ignorance no protection against the consequences of their choices. The weapons themselves, 48 SA-7 missiles that had traveled from Soviet factories through Polish ports to Belgian docks before ending their journey in an Israeli military warehouse, represented thousands of hours of labor, millions of rubles in manufacturing costs, and the strategic calculation of generals and politicians. All of it negated by intelligence work, naval interdiction, and the determination of a small group of Israeli officers who had refused to let those weapons reach their intended targets. In the archives of Mossad, the operation file on the Smuggling Alpha runs to hundreds of pages. Surveillance photographs from 4 countries, intercepted communications, shipping manifests both real and fraudulent, interrogation transcripts, technical analyses of the weapons, follow-up intelligence operations launched based on captured documents. Each page represents a piece of the vast machinery of modern intelligence work, the unsexy reality behind dramatic narratives. But at the heart of all those documents was a simple truth. A group of dedicated professionals had identified a threat, developed a plan to counter it, and executed that plan successfully. They had combined technological capability with human intelligence, tactical skill with strategic thinking, legal creativity with moral clarity. They had hijacked a ship not for profit or glory, but to save lives, to protect their nation, to prevent weapons from falling into hostile hands. The operation also revealed something essential about the nature of intelligence work in the modern age. It wasn't just about spies and secret codes, though those played their parts. It was about coordinating multiple agencies and capabilities, satellite surveillance to track ships, human sources to identify cargo, naval forces to conduct interdictions, legal experts to manage diplomatic fallout, technical analysts to exploit captured materials. Success required all these elements working together seamlessly. Years later, when similar operations were conducted against ships carrying weapons from Iran, from North Korea, from various state and non-state actors, the lessons of the Smuggling Alpha informed the planning and execution. The basic model remained effective. Develop solid intelligence, plan meticulously, execute decisively, manage the aftermath carefully. Each successful interdiction prevented violence, saved lives, and demonstrated that weapons smuggling carried real risks. The Mediterranean Sea continues to be a corridor for commerce and conflict. Ancient trade routes now carrying container ships and cruise liners alongside the occasional weapons smuggler. Israeli naval forces still patrol these waters, still conduct interdictions when intelligence warrants, still prevent weapons from reaching their shores. The Smuggling Alpha operation established precedents and procedures that remain relevant decades later. In the broader narrative of the Cold War, this operation represents how that global conflict manifested in unexpected ways. Soviet weapons bound for Palestinian groups, intercepted by Israeli forces, in waters claimed by no nation, all part of the vast chess game between East and West that played out from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. Every move had counters, every strategy had vulnerabilities, every victory was temporary. For the individuals involved, from David Kimchi planning in Tel Aviv, to Sergeant Almog boarding in the Mediterranean, to Captain Henriksen commanding his final voyage, the operation represented a moment when abstract geopolitics became intensely personal. Decisions made in secure conference rooms led to commandos on ropes, weapons in holds, lives changed forever. Intelligence work translated into direct action, with consequences measured in missiles prevented from firing, pilots who flew home safely, attacks that never occurred. The legacy of the operation extends beyond its immediate tactical success. It demonstrated Israeli capabilities to adversaries, reassured allies, and established precedents for maritime law and intelligence operations. It proved that weapons smuggling could be interdicted effectively, that international waters didn't mean immunity from consequences, that the intelligence community could translate information into action, and perhaps most significantly, it saved lives. Each of those 48 missiles represented potential destruction, aircraft shot down, pilots killed, missions failed. By preventing those weapons from reaching their destination, the operation created a negative space in history, a violence that never occurred, a tragedy prevented. Such victories are hard to quantify precisely because they prevent events rather than causing them, but they are no less real for being invisible. The sun that rose over Haifa on November 19, 1969, illuminated a cargo ship that had traveled thousands of miles only to end its journey in an Israeli port. The weapons in its hold would never reach their targets. The plans of those who shipped them would be disrupted. and the intelligence gained from captured documents would fuel operations for years to come. It was one operation among thousands in the Cold War, one interdiction among hundreds in the ongoing Israeli struggle for security. But for those who planned it, executed it, and understood its significance, the seizure of the Siersberg Alpha represented intelligence work at its finest, not dramatic firefights or daring rescues, but patient research, careful planning, professional execution, and strategic success. A ship hijacked not for piracy, but for protection, weapons captured not for profit, but for prevention, an operation that demonstrated how intelligence, when properly gathered and properly used, could change outcomes and save lives. The Mediterranean waters that had carried the Siersberg Alpha on her final voyage under Captain Henriksen's command continued their eternal movement, indifferent to human dramas played out on their surface. But for a brief moment in November 1969, those waters had been the stage for an operation that prevented violence, disrupted weapons trafficking, and demonstrated the power of intelligence work to shape history in ways both dramatic and invisible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.